You all so much for being here. I just wanted to start by thanking you all for taking the time to be with us this morning. And I'm really excited to be able to bring to you the insights and tips and wisdom of all the folks who contributed to this panel. And I also want to reiterate Jorge's well wishes to Cindy and her family. She put a lot into this, and so we've been thinking about them all week, and we wish them the best. A few notes about how today's session is going to go. As Jorge mentioned, please go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat as we go. The chat monitor will make sure to keep track of all of those, and we'll get to them in the Q&A portion that's going to come later in the session. We've used the information that you all submitted when you registered to kind of formulate the structure and the types of things we're going to be talking about. So there's a chance that your questions early on will actually be addressed as we move through the conversation today, but just in case, put them there for posterity, and Taylor Sherrod, who's monitoring the chat, will make sure that we get to those later today. If your question is for a specific panelist, which may be the case for you, please feel free to put an at the beginning of that, at Patty Flowers, and your question. That way we know if you wanted it to go to someone specific. If not, that's fine. But that will help us direct some of our questions at the end. And then the last thing that I just wanted to say was to follow up on what Jorge said about sort of the genesis of this topic. We started with this idea of unstructured data, and we've ended up starting with qualitative data in this conversation. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? It's squishier. It has less structure in the ways that we're used to. It can be harder to deal with and take more time. And so we're really excited, I think, as a panel and as an IE team, for this to just be the beginning of a conversation about new frontiers and new ways of thinking about the data that we're using in our work. And so with that, again, I'll thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to kick things off with a kind of broad question that's going to allow our panelists to kind of dip their toes in the water. And we're just going to start by sharing some of their wisdom about just beginning to collect qualitative data, designing tools, asking the right questions, and some of their experiences with that. And so I'm going to go ahead and let whoever wants to jump in first on that, Alan, Melissa, Patty, Matthew, whoever would like to get us started, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Patty Flowers at University of Tennessee at Martin. There are a lot of ways to collect qualitative data. We've utilized many of them on our campus. One way is when you're in a workshop and you post, say, a key idea or a big idea, a big question on a piece of paper, and you give your folks in the audience Post-it notes for them to answer and stick it on the paper. And then we do a walkabout so that everyone in the session can see kind of the ideas, add to it, so on. And then once you're through, you got to take all that down and do something with it. And so that's where you start to sort and analyze the comments that you got and put them in some kind of form so that you can report back to your participants. That's one way. Survey questions, if somebody takes the time and effort to write out something on a survey, that's usually an indication that they had some kind of emotional attachment to it, else they would just check the boxes. And so that's another way to collect that data, but then you got to do something with it.
Which is the harder part, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Before you can even do something with it, you've got to know what you're looking for, what you really want to get out of it, right? And I know, Alan, you have had some experience with that in particular, working with folks at HSC. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So the way we tend to use, or the kinds of qualitative data that we tend to collect, is from student focus groups. And usually that's typically that's a follow-up to a survey. Sometimes it's the lead-in to a survey. So the way you use it as a lead-in to a survey, I think most of you will know this, is just present the questions that or the items that you're going to put on your survey to a group of students and ask them how they interpret that. Because sometimes people, we have an idea in our brain of what the question means, and then you hand it to somebody else and they take off in a different direction with it, which can sort of skew your results a little bit. So that's one way we use it, is just to sort of test out the questions and see how students may interpret that. And the other way is as a follow-up. So you ask surveys questions and they say they're unhappy with something. Well, what are they unhappy about? What is it exactly that they're unhappy with? So you can get a focus group together and just dig a little more deeply into that. So I'll just say that I'm an economist by training, so qualitative data is pretty far outside of my field, but so I tend to go the other direction. I tend to think about how can we put some structure around qualitative data, and a rubric, for example, is a way to do that. So if you're observing students in a clinical simulation with standardized patients, one of the things we encourage our faculty to do is come up with a rubric. You're looking for certain things. If you put that in the form of a rubric, then instead of it being totally unstructured, you've got some structure around that. You can sort of turn it into quantitative data of a sort. And so that tends to be the other direction we go, is how can we put a little structure around unstructured data. So
Yeah, that also makes it feel more manageable, I think, especially for folks who this might be really outside of the norm for them, right? And so, another thing that we talked about, I really love the examples you guys have given so far, because in some ways they're very simple, right? These are some things that we might already be doing, or things that we're familiar with in other contexts, like the sticky notes and the walkabout. Matthew, I know that we actually met while we were doing strategic planning at UTS, right? And so can you speak a little bit to how qualitative data was collected and the value of that in Yale's planning process? Because I think that's maybe a realm that we don't often think about, but where it's incredibly valuable.
Certainly, yes. So that the walkabout was a part of this process, but it was collected. So before we even began the writing of our strategic plan, we wanted to make sure we understood where people's hearts and minds were, and where we needed to go, and where people thought we needed to go. And so one of the ways we did is we had large group meetings with faculty, staff, students, community members. And with that, we had kind of big questions that we wanted answered. And with those big questions, it was a large butcher block paper. And we did that exact walkabout that Patty was talking about with Post-it notes. And they would go and provide simple one-word answers or a simple phrase, and be able to place that across the room. So it was active. It allowed people a chance to really kind of think about it. And it wasn't about having people raise their hand or have to even speak out about their particular thought. So it provided some anonymity, but also allowed us to kind of be able to see, and later on when we went into the analyzing, it did help us kind of group and theme some of these things, because there's certain ideas that you saw over and over again start showing up on those Post-it notes. But something as simple as just a Post-it note with a thought on it was a great way to collect kind of this information that we wanted to get out there. We also, during that strategic planning process, used focus groups, getting people together and being able to talk about it on that, a smaller group session. And again, targeted groups, making sure you knew kind of who you needed to talk to, and whose input you needed to get from. Also, doing interviews and actually, having some structured questions, but also looking to see where those answers led you, and being able to be that kind of flexible to be able to collect that data through that process. And then it's amazing how deep and rich and full, and just the number of data points that you receive. I mean, it was literally, basically it was hundreds and hundreds of data points that people were able to speak their mind and be able to put their thoughts out there and be able to provide it to us, which then allows us to continue through our strategic planning process, having all sorts of input that we can now help shape and form and frame what we're going to be doing going forward with strategic planning.
I really appreciate too the point that you made, which I think could be easy to overlook, which is having a preset list of questions that you start with. You don't have to only ask those, right? It's meant to be a conversation. You want to follow a lead when somebody brings it up, but also that means that there'll be consistency, at least in how those interviews or those focus groups happen, right? Which is a great way to help the integrity of your data and make sure that you're getting apples and apples, not apples, oranges, grapes, and something else, from wherever, right? And so I think that's a really good tip to help folks even just get started with something like that. Yeah. one of the things Cindy, excuse me, had brought up too, was she talked about using focus groups and other types of qualitative data gathering for the APR, right? The academic program review process, right? There's a lot of ways, even strategic planning, I know in academic departments that I've worked in, where we actually are doing this, right? And so a lot of us, I think, have more experience with this than we think, and it can be really valuable across all realms of our work, which is helpful. So you brought up, Matthew, hundreds and hundreds of responses, right? Which I think, especially based on some of the questions and concerns that we got in the registration information, is exactly what scares people about dealing with qualitative data, right? You get all of this information. Now what do I do? Right. And I know, Patty, you wanted to kind of kick us off because you have some experience doing that in a really hands-on way. So can you speak a little bit about how you have tackled, I think, open-ended survey responses, if I remember correctly, and making those useful to you and your campus?
Certainly. As we were putting together our QEP and going through the Foundations of Excellence process and a couple other things that we've had going on campus, in addition to our strategic plan refresh and all of that, we collected a lot of, well, we did a lot of surveys, and we had some open-ended questions on those surveys. And so we had to figure out what to do with those statements. And what we did was we printed them off and cut them apart so that we had little slips of paper that would have just one thought or one statement, or sometimes folks would get a little carried away and they might write a paragraph. But usually it was just, like one little thought, one statement, 2 sentences maybe. And we cut them apart, and Stephanie Colich and I call it playing paper dolls. We just literally sat at the table and hand sorted them. That way we read each question or each response, and it put us in touch with what was there, and we sorted them. And she and I would maybe discuss them, as we were going, or I would sort one group and she would sort another group, and then we would swap and say that we had the same sort or similar sorts. And then within each bucket, we might sort again, because these folks were talking about advising, and they had several different ideas of what we needed to do for advising. These folks were talking about our Gens 101, and that's our freshman orientation course. These folks were talking about what we do for welcome weekend, and so on, that kind of thing. And so we would sort those and either retype them, or we would take the master list and copy and paste into our buckets. And then we would share it back with the group. This is what we found. And we took all of these responses and sorted them into 40 big ideas. And then from there, we narrowed that down again and narrowed it down again. But hand sorting them, just printing them out. If we were looking at the Post-it notes, we would take the Post-it notes and put them in buckets so that we could then look at this bucket and see what was there. And if you have a huge data set, 3,000-4,000 responses, that's a little cumbersome. But when you're looking at a manageable data set, this really puts you in touch with what's there and what it says and what it means and how it makes you feel.
Yeah, thank you. I know that's a great point, that sometimes scale determines how we have to approach data. And so, Melissa, I know that you work on a big scale, right? UTK is a very large campus. Student life is very rich and robust on that campus. And so can you speak a little bit to your approach to dealing with some of the qualitative data that your division is collecting and working with?
Absolutely. I know that this aspect intimidates a lot of our staff, because this idea of even doing what she just spoke of, when you're talking about 4,000 sorority and fraternity responses, the idea that that staff can manage that amongst all the things they're doing, they're like, maybe we'll do something else. And what Noelia, who is my coordinator, and I, what we encourage them to do is work with us. We can help manage that data. We can help code that as a partner, but sometimes it's even bigger than that. And partnering with courses, graduate courses, where they need data to allow their students to practice coding, or students working on their dissertation and in certain classes. Those are great partnering opportunities because it not only helps tell the story of what's going on in the space, but it's mutually beneficial. The students are getting, or the faculty, whomever we're working with. We work with institutional research a lot as well and partner with that team. And so finding the experts on your campus to help you manage that load of data is something that you should lean into, as opposed to just avoiding the experience altogether, because there's so much richness in those, whether it be qualitative responses in a survey or focus group meetings. If you're not an expert in doing the coding and theming, or you don't know how to use NVivo or whatever, you got people all around you that do and would love to be contacted. So that's kind of how we approach it a lot of times.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about building those symbiotic relationships, right? Researchers need data to work with, students need data to train with, and there are a lot of experts on all of our campuses, right, who can really help out with that. And it's good for everybody, right? Everyone wins in that. So I think I'm glad that you brought up NVivo too, because one of the points that I wanted to make is there are ways to ease some of that burden technologically, right? And so you can use software to transcribe your focus group or to transcribe your interview. That's going to give you a leg up, right? You can use NVivo to code. I know that we recently were talking with some folks from Qualtrics XM who their survey tools are now able maybe to sort and code qualitative responses and open-ended responses. And so there's a lot out there. You're not maybe as hands-on and in touch with the themes the way Patty was talking about, right? There's some give and take with time and effort, okay? But there are tools out there to make some of, especially the tedious part. If you've ever had to transcribe something, you know my pain. It is a struggle, and you kind of sometimes really want to outsource that, right? And those tools do exist out there. So yeah, that's really helpful. Any other thoughts from the panel about just an analysis and interpreting qualitative data? Anybody who didn't get to share?
I know that I wanted to throw something in real fast, Matthew, and that is don't do it alone, because your personal biases will interpret student voices and themes one way, and another staff member or student may see it differently. So don't do this work alone. You don't have to, and it's important to make sure that you're being able to have other voices and other lenses review the same content.
Yeah, and I would echo that. So going back to kind of those large butcher block papers with the Post-it notes, one of the things that when we were kind of doing our preliminary coding is it happened immediately after the event. And it was a group of people that represented a cross section of different identities on campus in terms of, they're either staff or they were faculty, or if they were assisting in some other way. And so it was the coding was helped based upon the fact that it was timely. And so the conversations being had, those were remembered. And so, okay, this means this, because sometimes when you're talking about a very small piece of information, there's some potential kind of vagueness into that. But since you're doing it at that moment, you're like, oh, I know what this is in relation to. And so it helped with the coding, and doing it with multiple people who had kind of different viewpoints of, I think this is here, I think this goes here. It was amazing how fast we were able to, as we were going through this, like, oh, this is a clear theme. Here's a theme. Here's a theme. And then since you did it on each individual occasion, it then made it easier when you went to the larger group and compiled it with the other data from the other, instances in the other groups. Those themes started to percolate back up, because you were like, okay, we've kind of got these broad themes and we're starting to see repetition in them. And so having that diverse group of people looking at it is key. You just can't do it by yourself, because you may have your own particular focus that you want to get changed, and you might be like, oh, I think this all means what I want it to mean, But when you have other people like, no, this is something broader. And so I think, Melissa, that was an excellent point for that. And for us, just doing it as soon as you can, so that way it's fresh.
Yes, I would agree there too. You don't want it to get too cold. I mean, you don't have to do it immediately, but you want to do it while it's still fresh in your mind, and you still remember the nuances that were there as you were collecting it. Or, it's not always possible to do it right away, but particularly in a workshop kind of setting, you want to do it pretty soon. Now, if it's data that you're collecting with a survey, it's going to naturally get cold before you get a chance to analyze it. And a lot of times having, as Alan mentioned, a rubric of some sort helps a lot, so that you're reminding yourself what it was kind of that you were looking for.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, if in more technical, right, qualitative data language, you might build out like a coding scheme, right? And you might have a, block of the codes that you're looking for, those kinds of things. And so when you have that, so you remember what you're looking for, the deeper and deeper you get into it, that can be really helpful. And you can do that before, or you can do it as you're going and build that, bank so that you know what you're looking at. But it's really helpful also for validating like across reviewers, right? So you know that you're looking for the same kinds of things and you've agreed on what those codes actually mean to you as a group. I think that's really helpful. One other thing I just wanted to say about that, which you guys have said, is that, I know that this is the maybe most intimidating part for some folks, but even just getting to themes, right? This has come up in a little bit of everything that you all have said. Even just getting to themes gives you something to work with, right? Even if you don't get to the point where you're doing really down to sentence level analysis or thinking about how you're going to represent that information for a broader audience, just themes can give you an idea of what to do next, the next question to ask, an area to have a follow-up survey on, something like that. And so you can just even take that first step, right? And it can still be really, really meaningful to the work that you're trying to do. One of the questions that we got a lot in the registration was about ways to visualize and represent qualitative data, right? And so I think the way that we often see it is just in writing, right? We see it as quotes, we see it as pull quotes, these kinds of things, but there are ways to visualize as well. And so we're going to do a little activity here. I am going to drop in the chat a link to a Mentimeter word cloud. And I will also share my screen, because if you are someone who would prefer to use a QR code or go to this URL, you can go ahead and go here. So the question is, when you think about incorporating qualitative data into your work, what are the feelings that come to mind? And you can add up to 3 words or phrases here to get a sense of what you think. So I'll give you guys just a moment to think on that and put some responses in here. And again, that QR code is right there in the bottom left. So one of the things that's cool about this, word clouds, right? They're fun. And on Mentimeter, you get to watch it happen. So it's exciting. And it might be one of the easier ways to visualize qualitative data. You can put huge blocks of text in, right? I put my entire dissertation into a word cloud generator at one point just to see what would happen. And it was really interesting. And so it's really fun, but it can also lead to some really good insights. Okay. Look at this just in real time. I am not terribly shocked by what's right in the middle. Time consuming, right? We hear this a lot. This is good. Wow. Okay. We'll take maybe just a few more seconds for our last few thoughts and feelings. Time consuming, messy, insightful, intimidating, but also innovative, holistic. I see my word squishy still in here. Interesting, informational. So on the one hand, this is almost a quantification, right, of qualitative data in some ways, right? These are by count by emphasis. But we also wanted to talk a little bit and our thoughts on how this is actually incredibly valuable, right? And so Matthew, I know that you had been thinking about this in particular. So did you want to go ahead and kick us off in talking about the value of something even like a word cloud?
Certainly. So yeah, one of the things about qualitative data, at least for me, is in regards of how you're kind of visualizing, whether it be a word cloud or pull quotes or a narrative, is that it makes the participant feel like they have a voice, because if they see their quote or they see their thought presented, or they look at this, I mean, for example, I will say one of mine was time consuming. So I'm like, oh, I feel heard. There it is right there in the middle of the word cloud. It does allow people to kind of feel like, well, my voice is being heard and I'm kind of being given a voice through that. And I will say also, this is backtracking slightly, but in terms of even use, one of the things that we do at a small, on a very small scale for me in my area, is we do at the beginning of some FYE classes, think with ink, where we basically just give them some sort of prompt and have them write about it. Now, part of the time that prompt is, what was your favorite Halloween costume as a child? And just let them kind of write this down, and it's fun and it's easy and it feels very, it doesn't feel very, intimidating. But other times the question is, what do you wish your parents understood about being a first-time student? And so that gets, it feels like it's not intimidating, because I'm just asking you a question and you write down whatever you want. It's not a grade or anything, just write it down. And that way we're actually kind of collecting, almost in a focus group or interview process, this very simple kind of, oh, here's a question. And then we have full quotes and narratives to give back out to parents during orientation of, this is what students say, or let students who are going through orientation, oh, here's things that our students have said you should be prepared for. This is something I wish I knew when I was coming in. And so it really gives kind of that voice, but also it gives you these deeper insights into some of this information as well, because you're giving them space, as opposed to, oh, it's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or 5. It's this very specific, personal kind of information that kind of illuminates this broader notion that we have, but now we have why that's important when we put it in that way.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on the value of some of these approaches, things like word clouds and pull quotes? I know one other thing that we had talked about, and I think it gets to your point, Matthew, this idea of voice. If I had been designing a survey about thoughts about qualitative data and asked folks to choose from among a menu of emotions, I might not have put all of these on there. And I also might not have come up with these descriptors, right? And so some of those more structured tools that we use also predetermine the possibilities for our respondents in a way that just asking them to write it out for us does not give us, right? And so here we're seeing the specific word choice that each individual has put to this. And they might not have been things that we thought of. And as much as we focus group that part and talk among other colleagues, we may still never have come up with these. And so seeing the actual language, I think, that folks use can be really illustrative, and it can lead you in new directions that you wouldn't have gotten had you only given them, a menu of predetermined choices.
And I actually kind of want to touch on an actual experience we had on campus, which is we had surveyed the students and what are something that they were concerned about, and of course on the list was parking, because parking is on every list. It doesn't matter if you allow the students to park in the hall, parking is always going to be an issue. So, parking. Well, at one point we were able to ask, well, what is it about parking that you dislike? And of course, most people expected, oh, it's too far away, or I can't find a spot. Well, what came out of that conversation was, there's a giant pothole in one of the entrances to the commuter lot that students that are coming from the west had to navigate or avoid completely. And it was a tremendous annoyance to them. And, like, oh, it rattles my car and I keep, it knocks my car out of alignment. Well, if we had just been asking parking, we never would have gotten to a place where we could say, oh, it's not parking in the sense of they're complaining about it not being convenient. They're saying there's an actual physical, issue in the parking lot. And so we were able to go and fix that pothole because we had finally gotten, this deeper information of, oh, no, it's parking is the problem because I can't get into a parking spot without rattling my car. And, I don't want to keep fixing my car because of your pothole. And so we were able to actually immediately make that actionable and fix that pothole, which also allowed us to then go back to the students and say, look, your voice was heard and we acted on it. And so next time we ask you for something, the student's going to be more likely to say, you know what, they did something the last time they asked us and we told them, I'm going to let them know the next time there's an issue.
That's such a good example of asking the question in a different way, in a different forum, leading to completely different results than what you might have been used to, right? I think that's a great example. You just reminded me of something that I wanted to add, and it has just that quickly flown out of my mind. So it will come back, I'm sure. Yeah, I will leave it there. Any other thoughts oh, I know that some of you were at the discussion yesterday about data visualization with Katie Jones. And I think another way that our team uses this, right, is she talked a lot about complementing data with narrative, right? Qualitative data can be where some of that narrative comes from. That can be a pull quote that represents a theme from all of your quantitative data that you're getting. That is still a very useful, helpful, and sometimes powerful representation of qualitative data. If you're seeing the same sentiment over and over, you find that one quote that really represents that and complement it next to a really nice, graph or chart or something that can really add a human dimension to the work that you do. So, I think there's also a lesson maybe there or a point there in not overthinking what it could mean to really put that to use, because sometimes it's just about representing that voice and finding one good representation of that, and it can complement the quantitative work that you're also doing in really nice ways. Any final thoughts on ways that you represent qualitative data in your work before we're actually going to take a very quick coffee, refresh, and stretch break before the second half of our conversation today? But I'll let some final thoughts come in if we've got some.
Well, a few years ago, when we were trying to put together a rubric for the annual assessment reports, we kind of had an idea of what we wanted on the rubric for academic, but for student affairs and for the administrative units on campus, we were having a hard time coming up with what it really needed to have on it. And so we did a little workshop kind of thing to come up with ideas and put that together into our rubric and develop the rubric that we still use now, that's on our website for that. And we would never have been able to put that rubric together without that qualitative interaction with those groups of folks. And so not only are you looking at ways to represent that data, but you're also looking at ways that you can use that data in other areas.
Yeah, that's a great point, Patty. Alan, I couldn't tell, you looked like you might be about to say something. This is, back to my teacher days where I'm like trying to read body language on Zoom, which is really hard, but just in case, I'll call you out.
The eternal question that you always ask students, hey, I can't tell, are you bored out of your mind or do you not understand? Which is it? It's hard to tell sometimes.
It's
neither one in this case. No. I mean, it doesn't look like anybody's going off to get coffee or whatever, so I'll just pick right up here. I was going to tag along with what Matthew said about the follow-up is oftentimes important, and that's where the focus groups or whatever can really play a role. We had sort of the same experience. We had students that seems dissatisfied with the study space on campus, and we thought, I don't know, it looks pretty good to us. Let's find out. And it turns out it wasn't the study space itself. It was that there weren't enough electrical outlets. Our students tend to go somewhere and sit for 8 or 10 hours at a time, and they want to be able to plug in the laptop and whatnot. And there just weren't enough electrical outlets. So we looked into it, and unfortunately, we had to go back and say, well, we heard you. And something will be done the next time this building gets a major renovation. Because of the age and construction of the building, we can't do anything. And of course, they came back with, well, just a lot of extension cords. We're like, yeah, no, the fire marshal really isn't going to go for that. So unfortunately, we're going to have to figure out something else, and we're still sort of thinking through what we might be able to do. But so sometimes, it's not always a happy ending. Potholes we might be able to fix, although this is Memphis. I'm not sure that that really ever takes place. But for electrical outlets in this particular building, there was just no fixing that. So unfortunately, we couldn't go for that. But do you want me to just go ahead with this, or do we want to continue with the break? You
We're
tell
gonna
me,
take
Ashley.
the exact 5-minute break.
Okay,
We're
cool.
going to keep it nice and tight. I know
Sure.
90 minutes is a long time to be sitting and listening to other folks talk. So we're going to take exactly 5 minutes to stretch, refresh your coffee, do what you like to do. At
Cool.
10:45, we're going to kick off part 2 of the discussion, where we're going to transition, I think, more fully into using qualitative data
Okay.
with a poll. So everybody take a quick 5 minutes and stretch and get a drink, and we will be right back. About a minute left at the break. So if you're in your kitchen or wherever, this is me calling you back, like the siren of qualitative data. Join us back in Zoom. As folks are joining us back in the room, we're gonna get back our heads back in the space of thinking about the kinds of data we are collecting or thinking about and how we're gonna operationalize that data and use it with a quick poll. So that'll be right here in Zoom. And Jeremy, if you wanna go ahead and launch the poll, and if it doesn't show up for you immediately down at the bottom of the screen on Zoom, you should see a button that says polls. So if it didn't pop up automatically, you can go ahead and click there to find it. And we'll give just a minute for folks to go ahead and add their responses. Okay, it looks like we've got the majority of responses. Jeremy, do you want to go ahead and share the results? All right, not a lot of surprises here. I'd say open-ended survey responses being right at the top. I think that's the most common thing that most of us have built into tools that we're probably already using and work that we're already doing. Focus groups being number 2, I think that makes a lot of sense, but those are also complicated, right? You've got multiple voices. There's a lot to keep track of when you're taking notes, these kinds of things. And observations, ethnographic data, this is really interviews, okay? And we've got 21% of folks saying, or at least 21 of responses saying unstructured data is something that is kind of on the menu for you. And we define that for these purposes as like audio, video, social media posts, these things that maybe are even sort of like out in the wild that you might be going out to get. And so that's a really interesting frontier, I think, in what we can do with data, especially in higher education, right? Our students especially are generating this stuff all the time. And so I think we can definitely look more into that. Okay, very cool. All right, this gives a good sense of the kind of things y'all are working with. So with that in mind, we're going to kick off this second half just talking a little bit about operationalizing the kind of data that we're getting and putting it to use in our campuses and in our work. And so I had that Matthew was going to kick us off on this, just thinking about examples. I know you already gave one with the parking situation. That's a great one. But I know that you told me a little bit about some other stuff in your FYE courses where students are generating feedback for the administration. So do you want to speak a little bit to that and how you guys have put that to work on your campus?
Certainly. So yeah, as we mentioned, we did this Think with Ink, right, where students, we give them that open-ended question just to write. It gets the creative juices flowing before class, as much as creative juices flow at 8 in the morning in an FYE class. But the feedback we get from just those, and so I teach an FYE course, and because we're a small campus, by teaching 3 FYE courses, I teach about 10% of our total first year student class, because we're not very large, but it gives a really great cross section of kind of what that, of what's going on with the students and kind of what they're thinking. But even, to be honest, even what we don't get is somewhat helpful too, even from a qualitative, where if students are not feeling comfortable enough to be able to provide feedback, that also says something about kind of their engagement and their feeling of community on campus. But what we get from those items is really great, because it's things that there probably isn't another forum for them to get, and it's something that can be done even on a weekly basis through that. And then on the other side of that is that in the FYE courses, we have a second semester FYE course. Our students present a research project, and that research project is introduced in the first week. And the question is, what is something you would like to change either in the community or on campus? And so by asking that question, again, we're picking up a lot of great data from what do students think. And honestly, if in all the FYE courses, there's about, I'll use a perfect example. Every year we have about 4 research presentations on the quality of the food in the CAF. So we know that's an issue that we are working to fix, but there's things about facilities, or they'll talk about student activities or cultural traditions on campus. Since we are so new in the UT system, our students are very interested in building traditions and a culture. And by presenting that, doing the research, looking around, but also then presenting it to us, it's giving us a lot of great information and honestly ideas that we're then able to give to the right people on campus and say, this is what our students are thinking. And they think so much about it. They spend a whole semester looking into it. And so, it's not just something they're just kind of off the top of their head thinking. It's, no, I'm serious about this. And we've been able to take that information, even from those research projects, and been able to give it out to other areas where they can do something with it.
That's such a great example of, again, something that seems sort of simple, right? A class project, and it can transform your campus. And it just reminded me of what Patty said at the top, right? When someone takes the time to fill out the open-ended part of a survey, that means they must care about it and have some real thoughts. If a student spends an entire semester researching something, and right, they are dedicated and they really want that heard. And so that's a great way to actually make those voices heard. I'm going to open the floor to the rest of the panelists just about thoughts on operationalizing qualitative results and putting them to use on your campuses and in your work.
I'd like to definitely share thinking from a staff lens. We maybe we're going to go to a budget hearing and we want to request something around resources. There's a lot of feelings included in qualitative data. And so if a staff member, a director, department head, gets that heartstring kind of tugged at for something, taking one student quote to a budget hearing to support their cause for an ask is not likely to get the buy-in that you're hoping for, but it may spark an idea for further conversation and planning and maybe some additional conversations. So I have seen before where this one voice was so impactful to the person, but again, like I said, it just didn't land in the buy-in space. But I think that goes even beyond just a budget hearing. Actionable steps from qualitative data, it needs to be a collective theme that's been presented. Again, if it sparks an idea that you hadn't thought of, further investigation would definitely be necessary. Kind of like when you do a survey and it's like, okay, this is a sample of the population. Is it statistically, wait, what is that word? I just lost it.
Significant.
See, thank you. I wanted to say inference. I don't know. The words are all in my head right now, but right. Can you apply it to the whole and make a huge actionable change that's going to impact all students? So
Right.
just something that I've seen that we always have to keep in mind over here.
Absolutely. Alan, I know she mentioned buy-in, which is something that you and I have talked about as something that you've thought about, like that.
Sure.
Getting buy-in from administrators and other folks on campus to put time, resources, and trust into the results of qualitative data. If you want to speak to that.
Sure, and I think Melissa hit the nail on the head there. You don't want to talk to 15 students and go to the provost and say, "Hey, we need to reorganize the whole campus, and everything has to change." And on an interview with 15 students over 45 minutes. I mean, nobody's going to believe that. So I think the point there is to have a lot of different types of data, some quantitative, but certainly the way qualitative comes in is to add that depth and that richness to the survey data or whatever you have. And so I think getting buy-in is almost what I'm going to advise is a negative. Don't try to get buy-in just on the qualitative data. Show how it fits in with other data that you have. We talk about triangulating a lot and getting multiple sources of data about any particular issue or problem. But I think, to put it in more of a positive spin is that qualitative data can really be useful. One of the caveats there is don't go into it looking for or trying to get data that you're not going to be able to use, right? Don't ask a question that you don't know what you're going to do with the answer. And so it can be focused in that way by setting up the focus groups to focus on. It's called a focus group. It shouldn't just be a rap session for students to talk about whatever. If we're talking about student study space, then let's stay on that topic, and the moderator should keep the students on that topic and digging deeper and deeper, I think is one part of it. So certainly, I think at least at this institution, a health science center, people want to see the quantitative data. They want to see the survey results. It's a question of, how we interpret that qualitative data, how we present it not as something in and of itself, but as a corollary, as a support to this, as a richness, as a depth. And so we try not to overplay it. And I think that generates buy-in. I think people appreciate that we've taken the time, the administration appreciates that we've taken the time and students have taken the time to sit through these focus groups or whatever it may be, that adds something to that. And I just also want to say that it's important to, and I think this is true of anything we do, anytime we try to improve things. And Matthew talked about this as well, that you want to be able to go back to your students as well, because if you do a focus group, you're asking them to take 45 minutes out of their day and sit around talking about a topic. You have to go back and say, yeah, we heard you, whether it's survey data or any other kind of data, we heard you, we hear you, we're working on this issue. Sometimes we can fix it. Sometimes we can't. It's just, yep, we hear you. Unfortunately, this is a long-term project, but and I think that gets student buy-in. If they start to feel that they are heard and their input is being used to guide changes at the institution, that buy-in is critical, because in the next time you ask students to come to a focus group, or the next time you ask students to complete a survey, you'll get more responses and maybe more thoughtful responses, because they do see that it has an impact on how the institution operates. So I think that buy-in, you have to get it from both the administration and the faculty, and from the students. And so both of those things are critical. But all along, I think what everybody's talked about on the panel has been how to do this in the right way, in a correct way, in a way that's going to get you useful data. And if you do that and you can defend that, hey, this is not, we didn't just go out and grab a student off the street and ask what they thought. We actually went about this in a thoughtful and unstructured data doesn't mean you go about it in an unstructured way. You have a very structured way that you go about it, and that will get you, I think, a long way towards buy-in.
That's such a great point. I'm going to write that down, what you just said. I'm like, I want to remember that quote. I'm going to make like stickers. Unstructured data doesn't mean you go about it in an unstructured way. Well, that's it.
That was awesome.
Well, thank you.
The gem. And I know that you, Alan, are going to have to sign off here in a moment. So before you do, and we'll continue our conversation, but I just wanted to thank you so much for participating today.
No worries. Thank you. I appreciate being asked to participate. But anyway, thanks, folks.
Awesome. Yeah.
Give us a chance to talk about you, Alan.
Oh, that's right. Please do. It happens all the time around here. Might as well happen on the wider group as well. See y'all.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, I think that's such a great point, though, that to go back and make sure that people know that you did hear them. I've administered some really big surveys that happen annually at previous institutions, and I would read through the qualitative comments always, in part just to make sure nobody said anything that they didn't mean to disclose or that would identify them. And I swear the number one theme every year I did it was, I don't even know why we do this every year. I've been saying the same thing about this entity for X or Y number of years and nothing ever happens, right? And the response rates are exactly what you would think where that sentiment is. Those folks really never felt like they were being heard, that those results were not being brought back to them. They weren't seeing change or even just acknowledgement of what they had been saying. And so we were not getting great data as a result, right? And so closing that loop, bringing that back to the folks who participated is going to not only reassure them, but then they will remember that. And you're going to continue to keep your response rates higher and get better, more useful data, which is just really important. Patty, I see. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that is so important to take it back to the folks that you gathered it from. When we first started with our annual assessment reports, one of the things that folks said, well, we turn it in and nobody ever looks at it. Nobody does anything with it. It doesn't make any difference. So why do we do it? And that's has evolved into part of my job, is to give them some kind of feedback. You know, this was good. This, you need to work on this piece, or that kind of thing. And that's so important. When we were putting together our rubrics, we took it back to the group and said, okay, this is what we saw. This is what we heard. What do you think? Is this what you meant for it to say? And soliciting that feedback from them to make sure that what we had put together was what they intended for us to put together. And the whole idea of qualitative data reinforces the why. It's not just the what. It gives you the why, and it personalizes this information so that I can feel like my voice was heard. I can feel like I contributed to this event or this theme or this whatever it is, and my contribution mattered. And that's how you get increased response rates. And, you know, folks will actually fill out that open-ended survey question if they feel like it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. You were just saying something about, is this what you really meant? And getting to the why of something. And you had shared a story, think about math classes on your campus before. And I was wondering, would you reshare that? Because I think it's such a great example of change really coming out of something where you ask the why, and that it really impacts students in a very direct way.
One of the student learning outcomes for our math program is that students be able to write proofs and mathematical proofs. They wanted to, you know, be able to write mathematical proofs. And the data was showing that they weren't really good at that. And so the math faculty went back to the students and said, why? You know, what's the problem? Well, come to find out, each instructor had a little different twist on how they taught proofs. And the students told them, said, you guys are all over the place. We don't know whether you mean for us to do it this way or that way. Do you want it? And so the faculty then were able to get together and say, okay, in this class, we're going to teach this type of proof. In this other class, we're going to teach a different kind of proof. And in the third class, we're going to talk about when you use one and not the other, and that kind of thing, so that it honed their curriculum so that they were addressing the things that the kids needed to know. But until they asked that question of their students, you know, what's your issue with proofs? Why aren't you doing this? Well, they didn't realize that that was what was going on. They were all over the place. You know, everybody had their own different way of teaching proofs. And this one wanted you to always do it by induction, and this one wanted you to do it by deduction, and this one wanted it written out in sentences, and this one wanted it in line items, and so on and so forth. And so they had to come together and talk about what they meant. And that was so powerful for them to see, you know, this is easy to fix. We just got to talk about it, but we didn't know we needed to talk about it till we asked the students.
Yeah, that's such a great example of academic assessment data leading to a question that you can then bring back to a group of students, right? And think about too, like the transformation just in the culture of that department now that they think about, we have to be strategic in our curriculum, who's teaching what, when, right? That curriculum map has now completely shifted for that program by asking that question and then actually incorporating that qualitative, right, response from their students. Such a great encapsulation of that. You know, Melissa, Alan had mentioned not asking questions that you don't know what you're going to do with the answer or what you will, make of the answer. And I know that one of the things that you really feel strongly about are some of the stickier ethical dimensions of dealing with qualitative data, whether you're collecting it or what have you. And so I was going to open the floor to let you speak a little bit to that, because I think that those concerns are really, really important, especially if we're trying to send folks out to be like, talk to your students, do more. What would you say to folks before they embark on that adventure?
Yeah, this is an area that until I did a dissertation, it really just, I didn't understand the full ramifications of a few of these pieces. If I hadn't gone through a dissertation, I definitely would have landed in these areas in the world of student life. It's a space that I consider very important to build trust and ensure student or participant protections, whether that's faculty, staff, students, whoever your participants are. IRB is that place in dissertation land where you go through painfully. I love IRB now. I appreciate them. They have so many safeguards that I appreciate. And so I'm always asking, do we need to go through IRB for that, and partnering with them just to make sure all the bases are covered. But sensitive topics, we have health and wellness. We have a lot of sticky conversation spaces, inclusivity. Yeah, you can imagine all the areas within student life that students are engaging in those conversations. And so making sure that you're being sensitive to how this is going to impact a student from the beginning. What are you asking them to share with you, in what space and with whom? How are you going to utilize that data afterwards, again, for the benefit of improvement to the student experience and growth, but also in the protections. When I first got here years ago, we did a survey with around hazing perceptions from students. And it was an outside research group that hosted the survey. There was this little open box, and our students love a good open box. They will share anything about the topic and other in the space. And in that open box, they began identifying spaces, names, behaviors, and suddenly mandatory reporter hat started to go off. Do I need to bring in conduct? Do I need to talk to general counsel? Did we tell them that the survey was anonymous? Is confidentiality a part of this? Like, all of these things after the fact became part of our conversation. Now it's the front end of our conversations, being very specific in that survey. Are we claiming anonymity? We don't know who you are, and only if you self-identify in a space would we. And we are required to report certain behaviors and information that we come across. Not only that, but depending on the topic, and I think everybody in this room will appreciate this context, we have very invested stakeholders outside of our campuses. And so if we ask questions and we get data, we live in an open record space. And for me, I have seen data taken out of context by entities with an agenda that then can harm potentially. And so being very aware of the fact that if you ask because it's very relevant to your locus of control and your action steps and purpose. What are your outcomes? Why are you even asking these questions? And recognize that it can be possibly shared in other spaces. And so protecting, again, students and student voices. That's just something that has really become a heightened awareness for me specifically. And then in the space of building trust also, when you're doing, God, even when you send an email that says, hey, please participate, who is it coming from? Who do they reach out to if they have a question? Is there a space of trust there? Are they going to be forthcoming? Did you ask them to identify so much that you could figure out who the student in that program of study with that identity is? And will that harm them in some way? Do you need to know that? Do you really need to disaggregate to that level? For staff and faculty, if there's only one staff member in that department, do we really need to have them say this is their department? And then is that going to establish that trust? When I think about focus groups and interviews, who's doing it? Positionality 100% matters. And so are you building a space where this qualitative experience of sharing potential vulnerabilities and, hoping for transparency, not to harm, not to use against, but instead to pave the way for improvements and having that evidence to support changes or investment in a new space. So yeah, I could go on and on for a long time about this part of it. But yeah, those are just some key things that I like to try to make sure is part of conversations with staff as they're engaging in, whether it's surveying, focus grouping, interviews, any of those pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
trust and protections.
I totally relate to, feeling like you could talk about it forever. You could take an entire graduate seminar in qualitative research ethics, right? Like there's a reason those things exist, but I want to harken back to one thing that you said earlier. And then Patty, I'm going to let you continue this thought that, this is why those partnerships that you were talking about are so important. If this isn't your wheelhouse, that's okay. You can still do this work. Work with your IRB folks, work with your qual methods experts on your campus, right? They can help you find those potential potholes to carry that theme forward in the work that you could be doing, right? And so you don't have to do this in isolation. In fact, the recommendation is not to, and they can help with that. Patty, what were you thinking?
As in a former life, I was the IRB liaison on our campus, and in that role, I had to move IRB applications through our process. And when you're looking at that, it is incredibly important, particularly if you have students who are gathering this data, to make sure that they understand the ethical questions. I mean, we had student IRBs come through that would ask questions on whether or not they were sexually abused as a child. And you just can't ask those questions. I mean, I know that you're in a social science class and you're talking about deviant behavior, but you can't ask other students if they were victims of sexual abuse as a child, because you'd have to do something with that data. And number one, it's really not any of your business. But because you're wanting to collect that data and just, report out that we had this many students, you can't do that. And so a lot of times, as people on our campus know that I used to work with IRB. And so sometimes they will ask me, well, what about this? Or what about that? And you have to think about those ethical concerns. Is this a question for which it is important that you have an answer? And what are you going to do with it? Because for IRB, that's a huge thing, is what do you plan to do with the data? You've collected this data, now what are you going to do with it? If you're going to make a presentation off campus, you're, planning a big thing, you're going to a national conference and you're going to do this big presentation. Yes, you have to have IRB approval to do that. If it's something you're doing for class, and it's not ever going outside of class, maybe you don't have to have a formal IRB process, but you still got to think about what's involved and how that's engaged. And so it's important to think about those ethical questions, as Melissa said, that there's some things I don't need or want to know. Please don't tell me. So I need to be sure I don't ask that question so that you don't tell me things I don't need or want to know.
Such a good point. I think, we've talked about how qualitative data can help you get to the why, but you also have to ask yourself, why am I asking this, right? Why am I posing this question? Why am I forming this focus group, right? That why goes in both directions, I think, and that's really important.
And
So
Ashley, can we
yes,
say
ma'am.
it's not because you inherited it? I see so many surveys and processes that are inherited and they're not questioned, or they don't really know what the outcomes were that created all of this because there never were any developed. And so I always beg the question, did you develop this instrument? When was the last time it was utilized? And what actions did this data inform? Is it really useful anymore? So I think a lot of times we inherit these surveys and these different processes and don't really beg the question, why?
Yeah. Just because we've always done it is not a reason to keep doing it, right? Yeah. So we've reached the end of our general conversation time. I want to leave some room for our audience to ask questions. I know we've gotten a few in the chat. So Taylor, I'm going to give the floor to you a little bit if you'd like to share some of those questions.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Ashley. And thank you to everyone on the panel. That was a great discussion. So there were two questions that came through the chat. So one of them would like to know if any of the panel members have started using AI to analyze the qualitative data they've collected. If no, are you considering it? If yes, did you validate the results in some way? What should someone using AI to analyze qualitative data look out for?
I'll be 100% transparent on this one. I am just jumping on the AI bandwagon. I literally feel like when my parents had to use a smartphone for the first time, I'm like, AI is just going to ruin learning. It's going to make it so that students cheat. And then I went, wait. They're going to have it. They're going to use it. Why shouldn't I as an assessment professional? And so my strategy right now has been more around identifying program theory to develop programming and help develop outcomes to guide our staff in that initial part. The idea of dropping qualitative responses into an AI, you now have elicited an excitement within me that will happen as soon as this is over because I've got some. So yeah, I would love if anybody else has done that. This is brand new and exciting, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I've said to you, my mind was blown when the XM folks were like, yeah, you can, if you have open-ended questions, our AI will not only theme it for you, but get like sentiment out of it. And I was like, that's really terrifying to me and also awesome. So that's really new to me. And so I really want to explore that more too, but it's pretty wild what's possible right now. What was the next question?
Can I offer some insight? Obviously not from the panel, but from a technology standpoint, I would also offer that with AI and generative AI, there comes a new privacy issues that a lot of people may not be aware of. And so, for instance, ChatGPT, you can actually take results and go to ChatGPT, paste data into that system, thinking that it's private because you've logged into it, not realizing that all the data that you paste into these public AI models become part of the public model. And so if you're pasting data into it, all that data is now part of the public AI domain. So please be very careful as you tell students and whoever that you don't want to paste anything into those types of instruments. And then the other aspect around the cheating, Melissa, that you brought up, that's a good aspect to kind of think of, but it's also going back to calculators when they first came around, Google when it first came around. It's not that students will use it to cheat. Because, you know, if they're using it to cheat and then we're also using it, are we cheating at our jobs when we use it to generate a fast outline or generate a fast policy to then go back and make sure it looks good and is written well for our certain environments? But yet those are all things that we're having to grapple with along with the students.
That's such a great point about the confidentiality and anonymity of you know, where you're putting data in particular. And also a great point about cheating at our jobs too. I'm like, you're right, a little bit. Yeah, we do sometimes. Those shortcuts are helpful, right? What was the next question, Taylor?
Yeah, so there was one more question in the chat. And so Brad was wondering, thinking about the elements that we've seen in the last two sessions with the dashboard suite and then also the data storytelling. He's curious about what ways we might be able to use the qualitative data collected to illustrate individual examples and stories that personalize or humanize overall trends that we see in our qualitative information.
So I think we talked a little bit about that with like pull quotes, finding that good representative quote, or even a couple of them can be really helpful in doing that. Yeah, I like seeing those kinds of things side by side, right? And I think that can be really helpful. I don't know if there were other things that the panelists wanted to add to that, ways to put these types of data in concert with each other for a more full picture.
And actually a follow-up to that was, you know, looking for ways that allow us to refine our analysis on our why statements.
Yeah, I think this is part of the real value of really reading through those open-ended responses, is that you will find those responses that came up over and over and over again, but there's this one that really says what all the rest of them were trying to say. And that's the one you want to pull out to, you know. So we had 400 responses that dealt with advising, but this quote said that we needed this and this, and we needed training on using an advising manual. And those are the things that you look for, and why it's important that we actually ingest those individual comments rather than just dumping them all over here and letting some machine fix them. You know, it's important that we personalize as analysts, that we personalize that analysis.
Yeah, which again, sometimes scale makes that really hard to do, but the benefits of being immersed in it, right, can pay dividends, I think. Melissa.
When I read this question, I think about my appreciation for our student life communications team. They've recently shifted the way that we tell our story in the division around our strategic priorities. And so while they're talking about what our strategic priorities are, when they're giving examples of how we are moving forward and we're seeing those results, they're very good about giving the overall quantitative data, but then whether they couch that, so they have the visualizations there, but whether they couch that with a student quote or a genuine student narrative, talking about how that personally impacted them. So it's personal to that one student, and they've got broader data that's reflective of a larger impact. And so the way they formulated that impact report, I feel like it just kind of marries the qualitative, the quant, it's supportive of one another, and it's keeping us on track with what our priorities right now are to kind of move the needle in the areas that we've identified for student life.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, I think, as Katie said yesterday, right, stories are really important. Stories are how we make sense of things. It's how we organize the world and interact with it. And yeah, a narrative granted, now we're talking about something that fits on a page, right, in an impact report, but the narrative, not even just a quote, can be even more impactful. Matthew?
Yeah, I remember a director of IR once said to me, they said an anecdote is not data. And that may be true in a broader sense, but an anecdote can illustrate data very well, and it becomes a story and it becomes personal. And I think for a lot of decisions we make on campus at any various level, whether it be in the classroom or whether it be administratively, changing the preposition is a really big thing to do. And if you can explain these things and provide that story, things stop happening to people and they start happening because of or for people. And if you can tell that story, you then are able to explain what it is, why this is happening, versus people feeling like it's being forced upon them. It's that, we have this information. Here's a story that explains why this is happening.
Yeah, I also wrote that down, changing the preposition. You guys are full of amazing
like
little nuggets.
And
But-
I think you make a very valid point that an anecdote may or may not be data, but when you have numerous anecdotes that are kind of going in the same direction, now it becomes data. And that's part of the real value, I think, of gathering qualitative information is, I got 15 anecdotes that are all moving in the same direction. Now it becomes data.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, we have reached nearly the end of our time together. It has flown by, and I wish we had more time. We don't, and we all could probably use a break, but this has been really enriching. I have learned a lot in working with you all, and I hope that the audience has enjoyed this conversation and is taking maybe even more than just the quippy nuggets about prepositions and unstructured data with them, some good tips and things to think about. And so I really want to thank the panelists for being here today, for spending their time preparing for this with me and generating this content, and for all of you who shared thoughts along the way. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Hester, our Director of Institutional Research, to wrap things up for the day. And again, my sincerest thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you all for joining us today and participating in this terrific panel discussion on utilizing qualitative data. I'm so used to the other word. I want to especially thank Ashley Ludwig for moderating today's panel, and echo her thanks to our panelists, Melissa Brown, Matthew Little, Patty Flowers, and Alan DuPont for sharing their experience and advice with us. It was interesting to learn about the different ways campuses plan, collect, and add elements of structure to these valuable qualitative data to bring some order and measurability to them in order to use them and add more depth to our traditional offerings of decision support metrics. For those of you who've attended Tuesdays or Wednesdays summit sessions, now I saw a lot of familiar faces again today. You've already heard me say this, but if we weren't able to get to your questions today, or if you want to get in touch with any of this week's presenters, the link to our website where you can find everyone's contact information is in the chat for you. Finally, next week, you'll be invited to share your feedback on the summit, so please keep an eye out for a follow-up survey and an email from our team. The survey will also be your opportunity to let us know if you'd like to be included in any other networking opportunities. Let me also say that our plan is for this to have been the first of a series of annual summits, and we hope that the conversations that began here will continue and lead to more collaborations in the future. In fact, the primary catalyst for the summit was the IE team's desire to exemplify the spirit of collaboration that underpins the system's One UT values. In closing, we greatly appreciate your participation in this year's inaugural Data Summit. Planning for next year's summit begins now, so please be on the lookout for future outreach from the UT System IE team. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.